This is lecture 5.3 for Psych 440, Combining Criteria. In this lecture, we're going to talk about what we do when performance is complicated, and we need a combination of criteria to be able to describe it well, which turns out to be the case in most jobs most of the time. We're going to talk about the difference between using multiple criteria and putting those criteria together into a composite criterion. We'll talk about how we create those composites differently depending on our purpose. And we'll talk a little bit about objective and subjective criteria and how it's often a very good idea to use a combination of objective and subjective criteria to get the most complete picture of what performance really means on a job. As we've been discussing, performance on most jobs is multidimensional. We've been talking about Campbell's model and the many different dimensions of performance that he identified. We've talked about the difference between task and contextual performance. In fact, it's very, very rare in the workplace that we really just expect somebody to do one thing and only one thing. This gets complicated when we go to assess performance because those different aspects of performance don't necessarily have anything to do with one another. A person could be very, very good at task-specific or job-specific task proficiency and not very good at communication or very good at supervision. In some cases, different aspects of performance might even compensate for one another. For example, consider a computer programmer whose job is to accomplish a particular task with their computer program. Some programmers work very quickly. They might be able to accomplish that task in just a few lines of code, and then it might not matter if they show up regularly for work for the rest of the week. Another programmer might be much slower. They might really need that time. They might just need more in-office, on-task time to accomplish that same goal. So in that case, a really high amount of skill might be able to compensate for poor attendance. A really good, diligent, conscientious employee who's always there might be able to compensate a little bit for not having that same high level of skill. In these cases, we don't want to just use one measure of performance. It's not appropriate. We're going to miss things. We're going to overlook what people are good at and where they're really putting in their effort if we treat performance as if it's just one overall thing. It's going to be hard to give feedback. It's going to be hard to create changes in performance. So very often in organizations, to really address the complex reality of the jobs that we're working with, we need to use something more complex than just one criterion. We can do this in two ways. We can use multiple criteria, which are several different scores on several different criteria. Instead of just having one score, we have a whole set of scores in multiple criteria. Or we can integrate those multiple criteria into a composite. The difference is that when we use multiple criteria, we end up with a set of scores. When we use a composite, at the end of the day, we end up with one score that represents a combination of all those other scores. We tend to use multiple criteria when we're interested in understanding things. So for research purposes, it's often much better to use multiple criteria because then you can understand how people get to be good at different aspects of the job. In the same way, if we're giving feedback or trying to develop employees, it's often much better to use those multiple criteria. You can give someone a clear picture of what they're doing well, what they need to improve on, and really be sure that you understand the details of what's going on. Organizations use the idea of multiple criteria. If you've ever worked for an organization that used a scorecard or a dashboard, many organizations create these really cool visual displays of a bunch of different performance criteria that are important to them. So a manager of a sales department might have a scorecard that shows this is how many units we sold this week, this is what our profit margin was, this is how many new customer contacts we made, and be able to see all of those multiple criteria in one place at once. So although it may sound like it's complicated to use multiple criteria simultaneously, organizations actually do this all the time. Where those multiple criteria aren't so useful, though, is when we need to make decisions about people. For example, if we're trying to identify our top employee for a promotion or a bonus, if we're trying to make an argument that someone's performance is consistently unacceptable and they need to be terminated, it's harder to look at a set of data points when some of them are positive and some of them are negative and come to a consistent decision. So in decision-making contexts, we often solve this problem by creating a composite criterion. A composite criterion is where we take all of our multiple criteria, we give them weights, we might weight them all equally, or we might assign higher weights to ones that we think are more important, and we add them all together into a single score for each person. When we have that composite criterion, it's much easier to make big picture decisions and say, yes, this person meets the standard, no, this person doesn't. The challenge, though, is then interpreting what does that overall performance score mean? As we were just discussing on the last slide, sometimes performance aspects compensate for one another. So it's possible for people who both have fairly high scores on a composite criterion to have gotten there in different ways. So when we just look at our composite criteria, we don't necessarily know why somebody got the score they did. Did they get it because they were really good at task performance? Did they get it because they were really good at contextual performance? If somebody has a really high score on the composite, it's probably safe to assume they're good at everything. But once people's scores are in between, there's different ways they might have gotten to that same score. So it's not as helpful if we are trying to give developmental feedback or if we're trying to really understand the details of a person's performance. To make it just a little bit more complicated, we may create our composite differently for different kinds of decisions. If we're weighting our criteria according to their importance, in different circumstances, different criteria might mean different things to us. So if you want to consider, we might have a set of 6 aspects of performance that are really important. Say we want our employees to be punctual, we want them to perform well, we want them to get along well with other people, we want them to show some leadership, they need to have some basic computer skills, and they need to be organized. Depending on whether we're interested in identifying candidates for promotion or for termination, we might consider those to be very, very different. If we're considering whether we want to let someone go, we maybe don't really care all that much about their leadership behaviors. If they're not showing good performance in other aspects, but they're a really great leader, they're probably still not somebody that we want to keep in the organization if they can't get their own job done. So we might weigh things like performance quality and punctuation very heavily in our criterion to determine whether somebody should be asked to leave the organization. On the other hand, if we're trying to identify candidates for promotion, we really want to weight things like leadership behaviors and interpersonal skills heavily. Those are the people we want to be good managers in the future, people that we want to move up in the organization. So when we design a composite, we've got to think about how we intend it to be used. What's our goal? We might weight those different performance criteria differently, depending on what kind of a decision it is that we want to make. Now, the last big thing that we have to talk about when we talk about putting criteria together is what kind of criteria are we working with? Are we using objective or subjective criteria? We often think about objective as meaning something like fair or unbiased. Properly, the definition of an objective criterion is something that can be counted, something that doesn't require any individual evaluation of something. So objective criteria that are used in organizations include things like the number of days a person was absent, the number of units they produced, the number of accidents that were reported, because these are things the organization can keep records of, and they just have to count them. They don't have to interpret them any further than this. Lots of organizations really like objective criteria, again, because we tend to associate the word objective with the words fair and unbiased. Because these don't require a person's judgment, we tend to view them as fairer kinds of criteria. However, it turns out that there is still some judgment involved when we decide what gets counted. How late does a person have to be before we consider them late? Who's responsible for marking them late? Is it their supervisor? Is it the time they punched into a clock? Do we allow any leniency if there's major road construction or a major weather event? Even though on paper it looks like a straightforward count, there are decisions that have to be made in deciding what goes into that objective criterion. And so it's important to kind of separate the notion of objective from the notion of perfectly fair. If your supervisor is the one who records whether you're late, even though number of days late is still just an objective count, there could be quite a bit of bias, there could be quite a bit of unfairness going on in that evaluation. If you're talking about things like units produced, you might have to think about, well, are you counting units that meet a particular quality standard? Is your equipment the same speed and quality as the equipment of the person next to you? Objective criteria aren't always perfectly fair. On the other side, subjective criteria are criteria that involve a person's evaluation of something. So supervisor ratings of your performance, peer ratings, even subordinate ratings, customer survey feedback, those all involve a person making a judgment or an evaluation about your performance. The major criticism of subjective criteria is that they could be susceptible to bias. In the language of criteria, we talk about this as contamination, extra stuff that's not really your job performance, that nevertheless impacts how you're evaluated and rated. We use subjective criteria in organizations for a couple of reasons. One is that some things can't be counted. The quality of your interpersonal skills is not something that we can track in an objective way. We need people's interpretations and evaluations in order to make sense of that. So many things that we care about in the workplace just don't lend themselves to objective, countable kinds of measures. And when we're talking about things that are complex, human beings can often be much more efficient and much more effective at processing all of that information than an objective criterion. And I'll give you an example. Consider customer satisfaction. If we wanted an objective, judgment-free indicator of customer satisfaction, we might perhaps look at something like, did the customer come back and make a repeat purchase? That would be, it's countable, we don't require any evaluation or judgment in that. Did they come back and make a repeat purchase? But you could imagine that a really good customer service representative could talk a customer into making a larger purchase now so that they don't have to come back and make a second purchase later. Oh, you know, down the road, I think you're probably also going to want this and you're also going to want that, so why don't you go ahead and buy those now? That could be a really effective customer service interaction that wouldn't show up in the objective indicator. It would, however, show up in a more subjective indicator like a customer survey where the customer says, I really appreciated that the rep took the time to help me think about what I would need down the road. A person can process that complexity, they can take the circumstances and the situation into account, but the objective indicator can't do that. So subjective criteria can be susceptible to bias, but objective criteria are often deficient. They miss things and they leave things out. So very often in organizations that use multiple or composite criteria, you'll find that they aim to have a balance or blend of objective measures and subjective measures. It doesn't completely get rid of the contamination or the deficiency, but it does help to cancel and balance them out a little bit, try to get a little bit more of the best of both worlds. In the next lecture, we will talk about how we define the process of performance appraisal and the multiple functions that appraisal serves within organizations.